Commercial aviation plays a vital role in our nation. We can all be proud of the outstanding job our industry has done in making sure the public can feel confident about our aircraft and about the professionals who maintain, operate, and fly them. But today we face growing challenges: more flights, increased passenger loads, and greater pressure to keep things moving and on schedule. Sometimes the pressure comes from those we work with, and sometimes we put it on ourselves. Either way, this pressure can degrade the margin of safety we operate under, compromising judgment and leading to cut corners that can and have resulted in disaster. This video is intended to stimulate discussion about the pressures professionals face in commercial aviation and ways to keep these pressures from compromising our performance. These 5 videos presented here are taken from real-life incidents and portray situations our own safety experts say are common in our industry. As you watch these scenarios, consider not only the stresses the individuals depicted experience, but how their attitudes and the culture of their organizations affect their response. And think about the pressures that are part of your job and the impact they can have on your performance. I'd like to take this moment to thank all the organizations and companies identified at the end of this presentation that provided personnel, equipment, and assistance in making this video. These organizations unselfishly contributed to this effort out of their recognition of the need to continually work at improving our industry's already enviable safety record. You know, safety doesn't just happen. It's something we can all work to achieve. We sincerely hope this presentation can help meet this goal.
A Lear 60 had been booked to carry a passenger to his vacation home. The destination is a non-towered airport in an area of wooded rolling hills and has a localizer approach. Pilot Brent Shields, age 32, has been with the company 3 years. He moved into the left seat a couple of months ago after a more senior pilot went on to an airline. Brent was thinking about moving on to the airlines himself. Though most of the charter company's passengers were great people, he found some arrogant and demanding. Co-pilot Tracy Gray, 25, who's flying this leg, joined the company soon after Brent moved to the left seat. After working as a flight instructor and hauling checks to build turbine time, this is her first charter job. The company didn't have much of a training program, but Tracy spent a lot of time reading the manuals and feels she knows the plane more than the hours she's put on so far would indicate. In fact, others in the flight department had been impressed with her ability to quote sections of the POH verbatim. Tracy finds the systems easier to manage and the plane easier to fly than she thought it would be. The destination weather was forecast IFR, but above minimums. They've already noted there's a nearby airport with an ILS, and they have plenty of fuel on board. This is the passenger's first flight with the company. When he came aboard, he seemed to be in a bad mood or upset. He'd informed them he'd stopped using his former charter company because they were unreliable. Midway through the flight, the passenger came up to the cockpit to ask about the weather at the destination. Before the captain could answer, she told him she didn't see any problem getting in, making light of his concern. That seemed to satisfy him. A weather update revealed conditions along the remainder of the route were worse than forecast. ASOS at the destination reported ceilings were right at minimums for the localizer approach, but the winds had shifted, favoring a crosswind runway. That would require a circle-to-land approach with higher minimums. The pilot wanted to inform the passenger they might have to divert. The co-pilot figured they shouldn't say anything. They had a very good chance of making the straight in, if not the circle to land, so why upset the passenger? The captain disagreed. He went back to tell him. The passenger was upset. He was paying for a charter flight. He could have gone to the other airport with a commercial airline for a lot less. If they didn't land at the airport where his car was, it would be a waste. The captain informed him they'd do their best, but safety was their chief concern. ASOS was reporting ceilings at 700 feet, just above the minimums for the circle-to-land approach, with visibility at 1.5 miles. The co-pilot said that would be no problem and rattled off the landing distance they'd need at their weight. The captain reminded her that ASOS readings weren't always completely reliable. The aircraft was cleared for the localizer circle to land approach. The first approach they went missed, though they broke out for a moment just before applying full power. The ceilings were right where ASOS reported, but visibility only appeared to be about 1 mile in mist. The co-pilot said she was too fast by 5 knots and wanted to go back for another try. The pilot suggested they could also do the straight in, but the co-pilot said she'd prefer the circling approach. It would be good practice. ATC vectored them for another approach. The co-pilot slowed the plane down, aiming for 5 knots below the usual approach speed. This time they broke out with the runway in sight, and the co-pilot began to maneuver the plane for the circling approach. The pilot reminded the co-pilot to maintain visual contact with the runway. She said, "Roger that. I won't let it out of my sight." A major airline recently inaugurated service to a regional market from its hub in the Midwest. 2 daily flights on Airbus 320s were scheduled. Captain Steve Beckett, one of the company's senior pilots, was the PIC on 3211, the afternoon flight. First Officer Wayne Golari, a recent hire, had almost as much experience in the 320 as Captain Beckett. After flying for a cargo company 3 years ago, he'd taken a job with a startup airline, but the company had gone out of business. Golari was filling in for a first officer who had had a family emergency. This was the first time he and the captain had flown together. This would be the captain's last flight of the day. His son's high school basketball team was playing in a regional playoff game that night, and the proud captain had told everyone he wouldn't miss the tip-off for the world. With the passengers boarded, the crew went through its startup checklist. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 1650 local time, right on schedule. But the tug pushing the aircraft developed a mechanical problem, and it took 20 minutes before the pushback was complete. After starting the number 1 engine, the number 2 engine wouldn't start because the right igniter was inoperative. The captain explained he'd like to avoid writing up the problem with the igniter now. The airline had no maintenance capability at the airport, and it would take hours before they could swap aircraft or get maintenance personnel here. With no frontal activity or heavy rain between them and their destination on this short hop, flying without the igniter was no big deal. Besides, he said, with service to the new market just starting, no one at headquarters would be happy about holding up the flight for what was just a matter of paperwork. The first officer agreed it was unlikely they'd need either igniter, but said he didn't want to operate contrary to company policy. The captain, knowing the first officer's experience in 320s, asked how many times he'd used an igniter in flight except in heavy rain. The first officer complied. As the aircraft taxied to the runway, isolated air mass thunderstorms were popping up around the airport. Flight 3211 was number 5 for departure. The crew watched on the radar as the convective activity quickly built and moved toward the airport. The tower issued a wind shear alert, but monitoring departure, the crew heard no reports of turbulence. Flight 3211 was instructed to taxi into position. The crew could see a cell moving toward the departure end of the runway. As they taxied, the crew noted lightning from the nearby cell. The first officer, who was flying this leg, questioned if they should delay their departure. The captain answered that they had plenty of visibility to get around the cell, and there were no reports of any turbulence from departing aircraft. The tower cleared Flight 3211 for departure, but no sooner was the takeoff clearance given than the airliner that had just departed reported encountering severe turbulence and requested an immediate turn. Without consulting the first officer, the captain asked the tower for a departure delay until the cell cleared the area. The tower advised them to proceed down the runway and exit at the first taxiway. Within 15 minutes, the cell had moved east and was no factor. Their departure proceeded without incident. The destination forecast was 4 miles visibility in haze and ceilings of 3,000 feet. During the descent, the crew was instructed to reduce speed and expect delays. An arrival had just blown tires during a hard landing, and the aircraft had to be towed off the runway. Switching from the center frequency, the crew was given holding instructions and told to expect further clearance at 20 past the hour, another 15 minutes. The first officer proceeded to the fix. 10 minutes later, in the hold, the controller announced the damaged aircraft was still on the runway and the hold would continue. If the delay continued, the captain told the first officer he might be late for the start of his son's game. The first officer noted the hold's impact on their fuel reserve. The captain replied when they got down to 9,000 pounds of fuel, if they were still holding, they'd proceed to their alternate half an hour away. Checking weather, dispatch informed the crew heavy air mass thunderstorms were forming in the vicinity of the alternate. The fuel was just above 9,000 pounds when the controller cleared the first holding aircraft for an approach. The captain asked the controller how long before Flight 3211 would be cleared in. The controller estimated no more than 10 minutes, but said he couldn't be sure. The first officer turned to the captain and said,
"Captain, we're at 9,000 pounds. Should we get a clearance to our alternate?"
A corporate-owned King Air, operated by a professionally trained crew, was ready to depart for a 50-minute flight to the company's ranch for a weekend business retreat. Both crew members were familiar with the destination and route. The flight would be conducted under an IFR flight plan in VMC conditions. The captain, Mike Esterbrook, had more than 4,000 hours as PIC in the King Air, and over 12,000 hours total time. In fact, he had been hired just a month before, both for his experience in the aircraft and to fill the need for a captain mentor within the flight department. The co-pilot, Alan Platt, arrived late. Though qualified in the aircraft, he was below company flight time requirements. Thus, he was relegated to co-pilot responsibilities only, a limitation he felt was unfair. Aboard the aircraft was a member of the senior management team and his wife. Although the executive's wife was uneasy about flying, she was confident of the crew's abilities and felt better about traveling on the company planes than the airlines. Besides, everyone in the department was aware of her anxiousness and usually did all they could to make her ride especially smooth and uneventful. Maintenance had completed its pre-flight inspection and had found no anomalies. The aircraft had no recent history of any write-ups and was within all inspection and maintenance program timeframes. Looking over the inspection sheet, Captain Esterbrook brought up the rigorous inspection procedures at his former employer, the Blue Chip Corporation. The captain often talked about the way things were done at Blue Chip. Others in the department were starting to suspect he just used these stories to show off his expertise and experience, which annoyed some crew members. It also added to the resentment some felt that someone from outside had been brought in to assume leadership. Platt had an extensive aircraft maintenance background in addition to his flight training in the King Air, giving him solid knowledge of aircraft systems and the ability to quickly troubleshoot maintenance squawks. But he was considered as brash and opinionated as he was confident and capable by those he flew with. Platt wouldn't hesitate to criticize others about their decisions and flying skills. Meanwhile, he himself was often known to operate at the limit, which caused occasional counseling from other crew members. Platt asked the captain if he wanted to go over anything about the route or weather before departure. The captain replied they didn't have time, but said he'd acquired the latest weather and an important NOTAM affecting their destination while waiting for the co-pilot. This was the second time Platt had been late reporting for a flight with Esterbrook, and the captain was upset about it. Platt frequently talked about the frustrations of his dating life and other personal problems, whether other crew members wanted to hear about them or not. That made Platt a topic of discussion even when he wasn't around. Captain Esterbrook started to tell Platt how lateness was dealt with in the flight department at Blue Chip. The co-pilot muttered something under his breath to the captain in answer. The engine start proceeded without incident. As soon as all fuel flows and pressure and temp readings were in or approaching the green range, the co-pilot urged the captain to get taxi clearance. Sitting on the ramp with the props turning just gave the executive's wife more time to be nervous. Most pilots, he told the captain, got underway as soon as possible when she was aboard. The captain turned the suggestion aside, saying they needed to follow the pre-taxi checklist. The co-pilot was clearly unhappy with the captain's rules. With the pre-taxi checklist complete, ground control cleared them to the active runway. While taxiing, they were issued a hold short instruction to allow for an intersecting runway departure. That reminded Captain Esterbrook of something that happened once when he got a hold short instruction while working at Blue Chip. Caught up in the story, the captain started to go past the intersection where they were instructed to hold short, and the co-pilot had to stop him from crossing onto the active runway. Upon arrival at the run-up area, the captain began the required system checks. The co-pilot noticed an anomaly in the prop check and brought it to the captain's attention. The prop reverse annunciator remained on, indicating a propeller malfunction. The captain decided that the condition could be ignored because he'd seen it before, and it was probably just an indication problem. The co-pilot wasn't comfortable with the warning lights and said he thought they should go back to the hangar and check it out. The pilot repeated that he'd seen it before and it wasn't a safety issue. They could get the indicators looked at when they returned. The co-pilot disagreed. By now, the passengers could see the disagreement going on in the cockpit. Captain Esterbrook reminded Platt that he was the PIC and made the decisions on board. Platt said he didn't want to be part of anything compromising safety. If the captain wouldn't get the problem looked at, he wanted to get off the airplane. It's just past 4 p.m. in the airline maintenance hangar. The shift turned over a few minutes ago. Maintenance supervisor Craig Oleski is short one man. It was going to be a long night. Dispatch wanted the Jetstream 32 back in service the next morning. But the routine maintenance inspection had found a lot more problems than expected, and the crew couldn't fix them all by 0500. Additionally, due to route changes in the last month, 2 to 3 more planes a night were overnighting at the station, and all of them had to be inspected and serviced. The 2 new mechanics brought aboard weren't enough to keep up with the greater workload. At least something was going right. An A-12 inspection on another Jetstream 32 was on schedule. The only thing left to do was finish work on the rudder field spring. Craig had to relay information about the work in progress to one of the mechanics. Sometimes mechanics would tell Craig what remained to be done on a job at the end of their shift instead of making an entry in the logs, and Craig would pass along the information to the person on the next shift working the job. The paperwork would be done when the repair or inspection was completed. While walking over to the Jetstream, Craig got a call from dispatch. An inbound CRJ just radioed that they had a yaw damper malfunction. They needed a mechanic to meet the plane at the gate. Craig went to his office to check who was available. Curtis Simmons, one of the new mechanics, is working on the Jetstream undergoing its A-12 inspection. This is his first airline job after working at an FBO catering to corporate aircraft. Inspecting air conditioning ducting in the rear of the aircraft, Curtis noted the installation was a 2-piece duct joined by a clamp, though the service manual showed a 1-piece duct. Curtis was reluctant to ask the mechanics on the crew about it. As the new guy, they'd already been ribbing and testing him, and this was no time for practical jokes. He decided to ask his supervisor. When Curtis found him and explained the problem, Craig said the 2-piece installation was fine as long as there was a clamp holding it in place. He explained the planes had come from another airline. The service manuals documenting the modifications were sold separately and hadn't been purchased with the planes due to the manual's high cost. Donnie Mason, a veteran mechanic with the airline, had also just come on duty. He was known as a cut-up and joker, but also as a crack mechanic. Now, looking at the work to be done in the hangar, Donnie knew the crew had to get into high gear to get the metal out the door. He'd heard the last crew say they got the rudder field spring back together on one of the jet streams, but checking the inspection sheet, saw they'd forgotten to sign it off. He went back to the tail assembly to check. While looking it over, he got a call from the supervisor. A yaw damper problem on an incoming CRJ. Donnie was to go to the gate. He signed off the rudder field spring work before going to meet the incoming plane. Meanwhile, Curtis visually confirmed the two-piece air conditioning duct had a clamp holding it in place, then went to sign off the inspection. While doing the paperwork, the supervisor called. A flight ready for pushback had a hydraulic problem, and he wanted Curtis to go fix it. Before heading to the gate, Curtis quickly finished the inspection paperwork. He'd been to the airline's maintenance course, but he'd never had to deal with a time-sensitive situation like a scheduled flight delayed by a mechanical problem. By the time Donnie got to the gate, the jet with the malfunctioning yaw damper was loading passengers for the next flight. The passenger service agent was anxious to get the plane going as quickly as possible. Donnie noted the circuit breakers for the yaw damper were popped. Checking the logs, he saw a similar problem had been reported a week ago. The breakers had been reset, and there'd been no problem since. He reset the circuit breakers, said the yaw damper was an MEL item anyway, and declared the aircraft good to go.
Send it off, everything is good to go. Right.
Curtis, meanwhile, found himself at a Jetstream 41, facing a senior captain, the first officer, and a harried flight attendant who were upset about the delay. The captain felt the hydraulic situation was only an indication problem. Curtis thought he knew what the problem was, but in training they told him to use the checklist whenever troubleshooting a situation. However, he was learning in the maintenance hangar things weren't always done like they taught him in training. He began to review his checklist, and Curtis could feel the pressure. A cold front was moving across the mid-Atlantic, pushing a line of heavy rain and high winds. The weather was causing flight delays throughout the area. Flight 117, a regional jet inbound to Dulles International from Columbus, was one of the many aircraft held up by the weather. At the controls on this leg was Captain Mark Harmon, 51 years old. This was the last day of a 3-day trip. An 8-year veteran of the company, Captain Harmon had progressed through the Jetstream 31 and 41 fleets and had been flying the RJ for about a year. First Officer Christine Oster was hired 5 months ago. With a total of just over 1,000 hours and no turbine experience, this was her first airline job. The flight arrived at the gate at Dulles at 09:45 local time, 35 minutes late. That put them 10 minutes behind the original departure time for their outbound leg to Indianapolis, Indiana, scheduled for 09:35 local. While preparing for the next leg as passengers deplaned, the crew discovered the indicator for rudder travel wouldn't indicate full left and right travel. The captain called maintenance. Just after the last passenger stepped off the aircraft, an FAA inspector climbed aboard and announced he'd be conducting an inspection on the flight to Indianapolis. As the FAA inspector completed briefing the crew on his inspection, maintenance arrived at the aircraft. The crew discussed the rudder indicator issue with the mechanic. The crew and mechanic made several attempts to observe a malfunction in the flight control system, but found none. However, the rudder position indication was still incorrect. After consulting with flight operations and dispatch, Captain Harmon decided to swap aircraft. Meanwhile, inside the departure lounge, the passengers and the customer service agent were becoming increasingly impatient. Captain Harmon was getting impatient too. If their departure was delayed much longer, he wouldn't be able to make it to Columbus in time to make the connection for his return home this afternoon. 10 minutes later, the new aircraft arrived at the adjacent gate. Now all the baggage and freight were transferred to the new aircraft. Finally, the baggage was reloaded, passengers boarded, and the pre-flight checklist completed. Flight clearance and taxi clearance were received at 11:20 local, 1 hour and 45 minutes later than scheduled departure time. A construction project was underway in the ramp area, and the instructions given to avoid the obstructions were complex. The captain taxied the aircraft. At the end of ramp control area, First Officer Oster called ground control and received a clearance to taxi on Taxiway Zulu and hold short of Yankee 7 for a runway 1 left departure. The crew was normally routed down Taxiway Yankee directly to 1 left and was confused by the unusual taxi instructions. Shortly after they began taxiing on Zulu, the controller instructed them to look for a 737 on Taxiway Yankee as they got closer to the runway. Focused on looking for the 737, the captain crossed Taxiway Zulu and proceeded onto Taxiway Yankee, constituting an incursion. The ground controller and the FAA inspector both noticed the mistake after the aircraft was established southbound on Taxiway Yankee. The controller cleared the aircraft back onto Taxiway Zulu, and the crew apologized to ATC and to the inspector. The rest of the takeoff and departure proceeded normally. This was the first officer's leg to fly, while the captain handled the radios. But it was clear he was still concerned about missing his flight back to Dulles. Though the low producing the storms created several areas of turbulence, the captain encouraged the first officer to keep the speed up while en route to Indianapolis, and even pushed the power levers forward after the first officer set cruise power. As they started their descent, the first officer pulled the power back, but the captain reminded her of the urgency of making his connecting flight. He pushed the power levers forward to maintain higher speed in the descent, though he didn't exceed any speed restrictions. After being handed off to Indianapolis approach, the crew was vectored for the ILS runway 23 right approach. The wind was 310 degrees at 15, gusting to 22 knots, creating a strong crosswind from the left. The captain asked the first officer if she was comfortable handling the crosswind. She replied in the affirmative. As they continued the approach, the first officer suggested they ask for a circle to land on runway 32, as the ceilings were high enough to allow for the procedure. The captain said that would add further delays and indicated his preference for continuing the runway 23 right approach. The first officer agreed. The controller vectored them toward the airport until they had visual contact, then cleared them for a visual approach. The first officer completed a good landing considering the wind conditions. The captain was relieved. Now he'd be able to make his connection.
That was a nice landing.
Thanks. You know, that was the strongest crosswind I've ever landed in.